This is House Planning Help episode 388. Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in self-build or retrofit. I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and trying to break down the major roadblocks that may get in our way. Coming up, John Palmer returns to the podcast. For the last few years, he's been working on policy at the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. In this session, we're going to explore the role of building regulations and also understand more about how regulations are made and the process of complying with these regulations. And I bumped into John at the Alliance for Sustainable Building Products Healthy Buildings Conference. This was earlier in the year where he gave the keynote speech. So I think it's only fair that I do a shout out for the Alliance for Sustainable Building Products. It's a great organisation, a lot of expertise within its membership. We've had lots of their members on our podcast before, and they cover everything that you could possibly want to know about sustainable building products. How do you know what a sustainable building product even is? How do you use them? Other factors such as reducing plastics in construction, the circular economy, reuse, using natural fibre insulation, lots of topics like this. So go and find out more. We'll put a link in today's show notes as well to the Alliance for Sustainable Building Products. Let's get to our featured interview with John Palmer. This is particularly interesting for me because John has worked on high performance homes. He gets it. And now he's sitting on the other side of the fence, developing the policy. So it's going to be interesting. I started by asking John to tell me a little bit about his background.
So my distant background, if you like, my first career was probably, if you count that, was in the Navy. So I was an engineer officer for 16 years, looking after all the things on a warship that go whiz or bang or whir, so the computers and all the weapons and that kind of thing. That was great, exciting, took me all over the world and did very different things. Left that in 2012 and used my engineering background to pivot into the construction sector, very specifically into sustainability and energy efficiency. Worked my way through a few small consultancies and companies, along the way getting my SAP and Passive House credentials as I went. Also ended up building my own close to Passive House home. And finally, about 4.5 years ago, ended up in the Passive House Trust. At that point, I was trying to lobby government to do great things for energy efficiency and housing, and an opportunity came up in the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government to work on exactly that. So I shifted across from the private sector, kind of back into the public sector really, and moved into a position which was a policy position looking at that point, the Future Home Standard, the Future Building Standard, and energy performance certificates. That was about just over 4 years ago. Whilst the Future Home Standard and EPC stuff isn't quite there, it's very close now, so I'm pleased that we've managed to progress that over the last few years. And in the last few months, I've taken a secondment, a sideways move in government, and I moved over to the Building Safety Regulator to do some work with them on some of the processing of building control applications.
Well, there's lots of interesting elements to what you've just run through, including your house. And some of this may come up, but I suppose I have come to see you really to understand more about building regulations and how they're made and how they change and what all that means. So maybe you could just give us a potted history of building regulations and where we stand today.
I think there's a sort of apocryphal tale that the original building regulation was one of the Pharaoh Mehebe's rules about if the house falls down on someone's head, then the builder gets put to death or something like that. So I probably horribly misquoted that, but that's kind of the first building regulation. In this country, if you go back to the Great Fire of London, the result of that was a prohibition on using timber in the sort of external construction of homes in London. So that's definitely shaped the London skyline, and also the height of the London skyline as well was quite low. More recently, the building regulations, not just for fire and structure, but obviously for things like energy efficiency, moisture and all the other parts, 18 parts to the building regulations for any building regulations fans out there. More have come in and they've been tightened and improved over the years. The way they stand at the moment, and I guess this is a point about how regulation works, The building regulations themselves are what's known as outcome-based regulations, primarily outcome-based regulations. And what that means is that they shouldn't really set very prescriptive requirements for how things should be built. So if you look at things like Part B, fire, it's really, again, dating back to the Fire of London, it's build things that don't spread fire to other buildings, build things that can resist fire for a while to let people out and that don't burn down too quickly. That's kind of what they say. And then there's obviously a plethora of ways you can meet that. For most people, they would just like to know, well, how do I meet the building regulations? And so accompanying the building regulations are a set of what's called statutory guidance, otherwise known as the approved documents. So Part A of the building regulations, which is in statute, has an accompanying approved document A. So the actual regulation is Part A, which is in law. The statutory guidance is the approved document A. And what that does is that sets out the way in which that particular part of the building regulations may be complied with in typical, not unusual situations. And what that means is that someone building or designing a home or a building, they can look at that approved document and say, okay, well, if I do this, it's going to comply. But everyone should always be aware that if they are doing something slightly unusual, slightly different, or they're doing something which perhaps the approved documents didn't conceive of when they were written, new innovation, something like that, then the law is always what's set out in the outcomes based of the building regulation itself. And that's what people have to demonstrate that they are complying with.
So fire seems to have come up already because of this Egyptian collapsing building, perhaps, and the fire of London. But that's really interesting that you mentioned how timber was perhaps looked upon as something that was dangerous, don't use it. So are there ever unintended consequences in setting up some of these regulations? We understand why they might have said that, but building with timber today, we're back doing it.
Well, we are, but I mean, in some ways, history has repeated itself. So one of the consequences of the Grenfell Tower tragedy was that combustible materials in the external walls of buildings more than 18 metres are currently not allowed. So events often drive some quite significant changes in the building regulations. Are there unintended consequences? Well, that kind of brings us on to, how are building regulations formed and brought in, that there are always consequences, some of them unintended, but there are always consequences. And that's one of the things that whenever the government has to or decides to bring in a change to the regulations, there is quite a lengthy process of working out what the impact of that change might be. And that has to be judged. And, is this going to do what we would like it to do? Is it going to be enough? Are people going to try and circumvent it, et cetera, et cetera? But there's a combination there of unintended consequences as well. So, for example, in prohibiting combustible materials, timber, et cetera, above 18 metres, what else would people use? What are the non-combustible materials? Are there enough of those in the supply chain? What does that mean for design, quality of design, or what does that mean for structural strength? Are we somehow creating facades or whatever which don't behave in the way that they previously did because we're now using different materials? All those kind of second order effects are considered or try to be considered during the policy making process to ensure that, as far as government can be aware, those unintended consequences are explored and any risks there are accepted or understood.
And just a few general questions here. We're obviously a podcast about housing, but do the same regulations apply to housing as some massive skyscraper?
Yes and no. So the regulations are typically, often, but not always, divided up into domestic and non-domestic. So you'll have housing regulations and then commercial and other types of buildings. Some parts are common, they apply to everything, but other parts will be specific. Energy is being a good example. There are different standards and different requirements for domestic versus non-domestic. In the energy world, that's very much because non-domestic buildings get used in very different ways. So, for example, in your average home, the energy consumption of an escalator probably isn't much of a concern. In a large office block, it might well be. And if you have those running 24/7, that'll be a big drain on energy. So those kind of differences means that the regulations are subtly different. But some of them are common, obviously structural. You need to demonstrate structural stability, and for fire, even though there are there are different ways it works. Again, you need to be able to demonstrate that the building, to what it tritely, doesn't burn down too quickly, and that there are means of escape and means of fire detection as well.
And these regulations, are they a baseline really that below which this is starting to get dangerous? What does it aim to do?
So the primary intent of the building regulations is to set minimum standards for life safety. That is their origin, if you like, and that's where most of the regulations are targeted. There are some exceptions that have crept in over the years. So we've got broadband, electrical vehicle charging, those kind of things are in there as well. For various historical reasons, they've come into the building regulations. But the vast majority is about minimum standards for life safety. And it's not just about the structural collapse and fire, which are obvious threats to life safety, if you like, but there are less obvious threats to life safety. And here we get into the moisture, ventilation, those kind of aspects of the building regulations are there because if you don't have good internal air quality, if you have lots of mold and that kind of within a property, then that is also a threat to life, even though the threat is much longer term and manifests itself over a longer period.
So are we aiming to get this as good as we could go? Because you yourself, you said that you built a near passive house. Clearly, you might be enjoying some of the benefits of that. So what is the outcome if we look to the future? Are we pushing everything up, or do we have to stop somewhere, or how does it work?
Yeah, so that's kind of a philosophical question on safety, really. So first of all, it's very much a decision for the government of the day. So it'll ultimately be ministerial decisions on any changes that the government might make to building regulations. And they will ask for, from the civil service, an assessment of the impacts. So, as I was saying earlier, these second order effects that might occur from a change to the regulations could be extensive and various: supply chains, impact on labour markets, etc., etc. So what ministers will do when they're looking at that is they will balance the impact of the proposed change to the regulations versus other competing government priorities. And in some cases, it might be really straightforward in that there's a very minor change to the building regulations. It's going to make buildings safer. It has no impact on anything else, really, and it would just be do it. Other more significant changes might have much bigger impacts, either on the cost of building new homes, the complexity of building new homes, the material supply chains and things like that. So in those cases, government ministers will want to take a more measured decision, and they may decide not to do it. They may decide to do it at some point in the future. They might decide to do a lesser version of whatever the change might be in order to lower the impact. It becomes a proportionality and judgment call for the government of the day at that point.
Because if we look to France, it's quite interesting how some of their regulations are pushing bio-based materials. So is that what you're saying, that will have come from the government of the day?
Well, it will do, but I mean, again, we should take a kind of a step back to, what's the intent of the building regulations, and it may well be that the intent of the building regulations changes in the future. I don't know, but predominantly they're about this life safety. If you want to start to have other outcomes in the built environment, then it might be that there are other mechanisms that are better to encourage that, because the building regulations aren't very easy to change for the reasons I've just outlined, because the policy process, the way it works is that, first of all, let's say there's an impetus for change. So let's say someone has a great idea that we should paint all our houses pink in the future. So it will come to the relevant team in the civil service, and they'll look at how that might work, and they will evaluate all houses being pink. They will then form some options on how that might be done. Building regulations might be one of the options. They'll look at the potential benefits of pink homes. They might reflect more heat in the summer, and they might make people feel better about themselves, whatever it might be. And then they will put that to ministers, and they will create a consultation, because the first thing you normally have to do with policy is get the public view, or stakeholder view at least. So there'll be a consultation. The consultation will have to get ministerial approval. It'll then have to get cross-government approval. It then gets published. It runs for 3 months minimum. It will then be evaluated. And from the results of that consultation, there might be more questions that need answering. It might throw up, well, we didn't realise that pink paint has this effect. And so that might require further work. Then that has to go to ministers. Options for ministers, that goes to them. They will then may ask further questions. They may want different options. Eventually, let's say they get to an approved option. If that actually requires a change to the regulations themselves, not just the approved documents, the guidance, then that requires a statutory instrument to be laid in Parliament, which needs to be drafted by lawyers and then checked several times. There needs to be time found in Parliament for it to be laid. So I'm making the point here that it's not trivial, and that if you just want to get the building regulations to make all homes pink, that could take you anywhere between 12 months and 2 years to put into place. However, if you wanted to put in place within a local authority or with a local region an advisory that it's encouraged that all homes are painted pink in this area, and there's a scheme whereby you can get discounted rates on pink paint from the local B&Q and the government sorts that out, that could be put in place in 2 or 3 months, and it could be happening. So the carrot, encouragement, optional, discretionary type approach to getting things into the built environment is always much quicker than the stick approach of actually going through and making changes to the regulations.
And does that mean as well that these regulations, we don't just want them to grow and grow and grow and grow? Actually, we just want them to be the bits that are really important and concise. So it could also, things could come out of it.
Yeah, well, that's the other side of the coin. As you will be well aware, the current government is doing whatever it can to encourage growth. It is undoubted that certain regulations take time and effort for whoever it might be to demonstrate compliance with those regulations. Obviously, the whole point of the regulation is to make sure people exhibit the right design characteristics or get to the final outcomes, if you like, of the building regulations, and those outcomes are outcomes that are desirable. So in an ideal world, all regulation is necessary, all regulation is minimal, and all regulation is proportionate. Those are the tests that government applies when regulation is brought in the first place. However, things change. Things change over time. Regulations which previously were proportionate and made perfect sense may no longer be the case. It is also conceivable that proportionality risk judgment, which I talked about earlier, which ministers of the day will have made, it may be that equation changes over time, and so that the solution or the option that was decided a few years ago, because things have changed around that decision-making process, or that the factors and the consequences might have changed, it might be that it would be appropriate for a minister to revisit that particular decision on that regulation. So there is absolutely no kind of onward march of regulation to keep it growing and growing and growing and growing. And it's actually quite the opposite in that process I just described a few minutes ago. That's got lots of checks and balances along the way, which I didn't go into, whereby the necessity for and the proportionality of the regulation is quite regularly checked during the process. And if it doesn't pass the bar, then you're not going to get it through the process. So there is definitely a constraints on growing regulation, but that doesn't mean that if regulation isn't necessary for safety or whatever other reasons, that it doesn't get brought in as new regulation.
And what about compliance? That we've created these regulations, how are we making sure that they're actually being carried out, and what will happen if they haven't been carried out?
Yeah, so that's a very good point. So, regulation is nothing without enforcement, is the kind of the phrase. So you could regulate for whatever you want, all your pink homes, but if no one is checking or enforcing that we are building pink homes, which would be fairly obvious, but there are many.
It's quite helpful, isn't it?
Yeah, there are many other parts of the regulations, energy being one of them, where it's less obvious that you're complying with the regulations. So regulation is one side of the coin. In making and designing that regulation, surveillance and enforcement becomes part of it. So it's part of that evaluation of the options. So how would government or the relevant regulator know that this regulation is being complied with. What action would government or the regulator take if the regulation is breached? And that's obviously different for different regulations, and there's an element of proportionality there. But when some of these regulations are brought in, I mean, there are some in the Building Act, which is the legislation that underpins the building regulations. There are set in there sort of the penalties of non-compliance and what non-compliance means. For new regulations which haven't necessarily got the framework of the building regulations behind them, if you're bringing those in, you would need to, as part of the policy process, define what the sanctions would be for organisations or individuals that didn't comply. So that might be fines, it might be coming off registers, or whatever it might be. So that's all part of the process, and how that works is different for different sectors. For the building regulations, clearly the building control side of things is the main mechanism that is in place to ensure that people are building things that are compliant with the building regulations. So that is another area where things have changed very recently. So if you are building your low-rise typical home, then you would still look to the local authority or a private provider of building control to do that. As soon as you are building above 18 metres, if you're building a tall building or a hospital, but tall residential buildings, so a block of flats, for example, then your building control body automatically becomes the building safety regulator. And all that regime, the creation of the building safety regulator, the creation and definition of higher risk buildings, taller buildings, is another direct result of Grenfell and the realisation that buildings which are high risk because there's a lot of people in a small space, and if there is a fire, then there are significant potential consequences. They need particular scrutiny to make sure that they are complying with the building regulations.
And the liability, that has changed as well, hasn't it? That whereas at one stage it would have been signed off by building control completely, it's shared a bit more, is that correct?
So you have still got the basic process that the applicant, the developer, whoever's applying for the building control approval, remains responsible. They will still go through the same process of looking to a building control body to sign off and give them their completion certificate that they've demonstrated compliance. But what is different is that there is a lengthy liability period. I think it's 30 years now, whereby if there is a significant defect, then that the original developer could be held liable for that building, which is a change.
And they can't just close their company down and start all over again and then they've cleared all that?
There are many ways in which people can try and evade the rules. The vast majority of people who build in the sector, I think, are people who want to run good, productive companies that are good places to work, that build great homes, and that they want to continue to trade in their area and work in their area and build up a customer base. They obviously are companies which the government would want to support. There is a small number of organisations and companies who don't have that approach to life, and their approach would be to build whatever they choose to build as quickly as possible and then move on. And those kind of organisations are very good at trying to evade future responsibility. We've seen that with Grenfell, whereby pursuing some of the people who built buildings which have now been found wanting becomes really complicated and very difficult, and that's still something that's ongoing. So the regulation, is there, but almost as important as the regulation is the intent. And I think that's one of the things that the government is trying to really shift, is this culture of those kind of developers that don't want to take responsibility for what they build and want to move on. I think the culture which the government would wish to see, and not just the government, we would all wish to see, obviously, is a culture whereby whoever builds a building is proud of what they've built, and is very prepared to take responsibility and be accountable for what they built, and they know that they built a building which is safe and of a high quality. And there are many, many, many companies that already do that, and it's the ones that don't do that I think government wants to change their behaviour.
Just looking at the Pink Homes regulation that we put in,
Yeah.
So does it get tested at any point along the way to see well, will this work, or let's give it a trial period here first, or is it just a blanket rollout at that point?
Well, it depends. So some things, if the impact analysis is sufficiently confident that this is going to work, it's going to work first time, it's not going to cost a fortune or result in supply chains collapsing, then it can just be put in place in a fairly straightforward manner. If that's not exactly clear, then there are different options that can be taken. So one of the primary routes is to say this is going to happen, but it's not going to happen for a while. For example, second staircases in tall buildings came in last year, or was announced, put into the regulations last year, but there is quite an extensive lead-in time for that to allow the industry to plan and adapt, particularly because tall buildings take a long time, from project initiation through to build. And there's a few other examples where the government has brought in regulation, but has paced it so that people have time to prepare. So that allows those unintended consequences to be sorted out in slightly slower time by the industry, and if necessary, the government can work with the industry to mitigate any issues there. For things that is just really not clear, then there might be proposals to run a pilot of some kind, to run a small study. I think colleagues at DESNES have done this on several kind of different projects to run small pilots to gain that knowledge. What you do need to be careful of, though, is it's amazing how powerful signals from government can be, sometimes unintentionally. So let's say we decided to run a pink paint trial. Has that sent a signal to the sector that all houses will be pink in the future? And does that mean that manufacturers who only produce blue paint are now suddenly disadvantaged in the market and start to go out of business because they can't sell their blue paint anymore? Then the government's got a problem with you've just had an impact on a segment of the manufacturing sector, or obviously they produce different coloured paints, but let's say coloured render or whatever it might be, you've suddenly sent a message to the sector which has real live impacts on businesses and people's livelihoods, when actually the government may still only just be thinking about it. So you have to be really careful in government with these sort of what-if type trials without sending really clear signals that this is actually what's going to happen.
And have we seen that in a slightly different way with incentives, say, for example, for solar PV, feed-in tariffs, just encouraging people, and then one day it just gets switched off?
I think that's a slightly different area, because building regulations, as I said, is all about life safety, and that kind of, do we do second staircases, do we do pink paint, whatever it might be, is all based on that premise, and there's therefore a enduring nature to it. The incentive schemes are a different mechanism that government uses to encourage behaviours, so they're not necessarily regulated in the same way. So what they will be doing is they'll be trying to encourage either innovation in technology, market shifts, consumer behaviour, that kind of thing, and therefore by their very nature they're not ever going to be enduring. Solar panels being a good example, when they first came in they were you could argue prohibitively expensive. Incentive schemes offset or mitigated against the high costs, which meant they became affordable for consumers. When those prices of solar panels dropped to levels where they became affordable and payback periods without any incentives still made financial sense at that point, you could argue that they've done their job, and that money is then better targeted at other areas which now need the same kind of incentive to bring forward innovation or to bring forward economies of scale or whatever it might be.
What about communication of these regulations? Is there someone within every construction company, every architecture firm who has almost an encyclopedic knowledge of the regulations, and how is that side of it working? Yeah,
it's a good question. In practice, there normally is someone who's become the building regs expert, or even just the expert on a particular part of the building regulations in larger organisations. That doesn't mean that's the kind of the optimal way of doing it, the best way of doing it. So there is an approved document review panel that's just stood up that's going to be looking at not the technical content of the approved documents and the building regulations, but how they are put together, how they are formed, how they communicated, how they talk to each other. So, for example, is there one single definition of a dwelling that's the same across all the approved documents, or are certain words used in different ways in the approved documents? That does happen. So I think that communicating them more effectively, setting them out in perhaps a different way might be an option. Is there a more digital way of looking at the approved documents in a way that perhaps could be fed in more readily to CAD systems? Because let's face it, pretty much every new home will be designed on a CAD system these days. If you've got certain things in the regulations that talk about heights, clearances, whatever it might be, then you would imagine that it's not beyond the art of the possible to be able to have that level sort of automated, or at least maybe a red, amber, green indication of, are you compliant with the building regulations, or have you just put your toilet in the wrong place, or whatever it might be. So those kind of things, I think, are things that we need to look at, and if we can get a viable way of getting those to work, that will make a big difference, because you then won't have the same level of someone who knows the detail, or having to have someone who knows the text and the detail and what's in there. You'd have a much better starting point for your designer to be able to say, I think I've designed this in accordance with the building regulations. Now, that doesn't mean that that we should be entirely reliant on automation. There probably needs to be a sort of a check there at some point, but you might not have to have the same availability of people who know everything in depth. You could get the CAD engines and possibly AI engines in the future as well to do a lot of the heavy lifting for you.
Now, just bringing this back to the self-builder, what information and what interaction with the building regs are they likely to see, and how can they get better informed?
So the first thing is, if you're building your own home or having your own home built, the chances are it's not going to be above 18 metres, I would have thought. So you're not going to be in the high-risk regime. So your building control authority or building control body will, at the moment, either be your local authority or a registered building control or private provider. And at the moment, it's your choice as to what route you go. So if I just describe the typical process is you will need to opt for the local authority or a private provider. And then as part of your build, you will submit to your building control body your evidence to demonstrate that you're compliant with the building regulations. And that will be a bunch of documents and drawings showing that this is structure, this is fire, etc., etc. I think that for your typical self-builder, a lot of that will still be quite specialist stuff. So, having kind of built my own home, I was very keen, as I think most people would be, to have input over the design, materials. I felt qualified to have a view on that. There are lots of other parts of the building regulations that I definitely don't. I'm not qualified to have a view on, structure and fire, etc., etc. So you'll need specialist input for those parts of the building regulations. Some of that specialist input will probably sit with an architect or designer who does that day in, day out. Some of it will require specialist expertise, a structural engineer, possibly a fire engineer, your energy assessor for Part L and things like that. So I don't think that will change in the future. It might be that some of it becomes a bit more accessible with sort of the changes I described earlier of how the approved documents are presented, how the guidance set out. If that's in a sort of a slightly more codified form, it might be that you can envisage a world where you could sort of interrogate the building regulations and ask them questions about, well, how would I do this, or is this compliant, that kind of stuff. So I think that might be improve accessibility, but even if you improve the communication and the accessibility of the guidance, some of this stuff is still quite complex and quite nuanced, and you would obviously, as a self-builder, want to get it right. So you will probably need to call on some subject matter experts for some parts of it for time to come.
And retrofit?
So retrofit, the process is pretty much exactly the same. In some ways it gets more complicated because the new build standards, if you like, in their entirety, don't necessarily apply to all retrofits. So, for example, energy, there's a different way of deciding what energy performance you will need from your retrofitted building versus your if you were doing it from new build. And that's a reflection of the fact that you've got something you're starting with which means that you can't decide the form factor, you can't decide the size of the the amount of glazing necessarily. You've got a wall which you've got to work with, so you might not ever be able to get that to a particular standard. And that's reflected in the way Passive House works as well, and that there's a different standard for retrofit than there is for new build. And the other way that which the building regulations work for retrofit is that there is a basic principle of non-worsening. So if you're going into a building, and it really depends on the level and extent of retrofit that you're doing, but some things you will be touching. So if for example, if you're redoing an entire wall, it might be that you then need to bring that up to a required standard in terms of thermal performance. But other aspects of the building, possibly access, for example, the requirements in Part M on accessibility of a new building. If you're doing a refurbishment, you don't necessarily have to make your refurbished building as accessible as a new building needs to be, but you need to make sure that it doesn't get less accessible than it is at the moment. So that's the non-worsening principle. So refurbishment retrofit becomes a bit more complicated because you haven't just got a very clear set of here's the minimum standards that you've got to comply with. You need to probably take advice from your building control body there on exactly which level you need to reach in certain areas and whether certain things would be subject to non-worsening, in which case you can leave them as they are, or some aspects that will be like, no, you've now got to a point in this retrofit where you need to comply effectively with what might be a new build standard.
We started this conversation by talking about how your own background, you'd moved from delivering housing and then going through the Passive House Trust and then switching sides here. So you've talked about form factor and glazing ratios and all these sorts of things. Are they well ingrained within the department here? Has the message got through of how effective some of these things can be with housing and buildings?
Yeah, I think, I think, and I was exactly the same. My view when I was sitting in the sector in the Passive House Trust looking into government was, this is all really obvious, isn't it? Why aren't we building every house to be Passive House from tomorrow? And it would be great if we were building every house Passive House tomorrow from many perspectives. But when you get into government, you realise that there are so many trade-offs and competing issues and considerations that you as a civil servant don't necessarily have to consider them all, but ministers do. So we have to definitely present ministers with those trade-offs and those decisions, and that there are therefore inevitably compromises. That does not mean that the people putting some of the technical advice to the ministers don't understand these issues. So I think that my experience, certainly of people who work in government in areas of housing construction, is that many of them are quite deep experts in their fields. They know a lot about the building physics and that side of things, but they also know a lot about the construction process. But then you've got equally knowledgeable experts in other parts of the same department. So people who know exactly how the housing market works and how the development process works and how the supply chains work and construction products come forward and the testing. And so all of that kind of knowledge is in there, but that then has to be assimilated and refined into pieces of short, pithy advice for ministers in order to judge those trade-offs.
It's such a big topic, isn't it? One of the reasons that I got involved in this is because I thought I will always be learning. You will. But then that must become difficult because you're trying to take this whole thing that's going on and you're constantly on this roundabout of what's a regulation, what are we encouraging?
Yeah. I think I go back to my point earlier, which is the carrot is always easier than the stick. Putting in place regulation takes time. You're never going to be everybody's friend because whichever regulation you put in place, someone won't like it for whatever reason. Hence the rigorous process going through consultation and refining it, etc. But if you can put in place an incentive scheme or often government works with convening power. If it gets a lot of the key stakeholders in the room to get them to talk to each other and encourage certain types of behaviour, that is much quicker to achieve and can often have really positive effects that then start to grow and grow and grow. So the sector can do a lot itself with some relatively gentle help from government to start changing behaviours and driving different outcomes.
Is there anything else that we should bring into this conversation, maybe something I'm not asking you but is still important about building regulations?
I think that the way in which things may go in the future is that I think we might see the entire housing and even building kind of sector treated a bit more as a system. I mean, it is obviously a system and a very complex system, but the way it's grown up and the way it's developed, it's kind of been regulated in pockets. So you've got the building regulations, then you've got the social housing regulations, you've got the private rental kind of regulations as well, Building Safety Act. So there's all these different pieces of legislation that have organically grown up over time, all of which drive outcomes in the housing sector, on houses and on people. And it's a very complex area, but it's also a very public area on which everyone has a view because everyone lives in a house. So you're operating in an environment where you've got 70 million experts sat out there, many of which disagree with what you might be trying to achieve. So I think that the regulatory landscape will start to evolve to a more coherent approach towards housing as a system, all the way from deciding what you're going to build, planning, designing, building regulations, to building once you've built it in occupation. So all those regulatory regimes that govern how that works, they all work together a bit more seamlessly, a bit more effectively, so that the end result, which is people living in high quality, safe, decent homes, beautiful homes that are a pleasure to live in, that becomes more the norm.
Well, I think that's a good point to finish up on. John, thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Nice to talk to you.
Head online to take a look at the show notes that accompany this session. houseplanninghelp.com/388. We've got a summary waiting for you so you can review the key points once again. Maybe you've got a comment or a question. You can get interactive on social media. We'll give you links. houseplanninghelp.com/388. If you found today's podcast interesting or useful, or any others in our archive, we'd like to ask a favour. Please, can you review us on whatever podcasting app you're using? Because that helps drive more people our way. It also helps people understand what it is we do when you put it in your own words, how it's helped you. And that would be really helpful from our end and much appreciated. Thank you. And finally, a quick check on the hub. What have we been up to? Well, we've just held another Ask the Expert session with Passive House consultant Ez Trezida. This is a Q&A format, so yes, you get your questions answered, but you can also see what other people are asking and flick through the questions that interest you. So it's a great feature from that perspective. Also in the hub, we've got our courses that take you through step by step on various different topics. We've got the forum where you can interact with like-minded people. Perhaps you want to chat with me, that's office hour. And then we've got a number of complete in-depth video case studies where we look at decisions all the way through projects, just filming, putting them into different chapters. And finally, the live trainings from guest experts. There's a lot to delve into. And we always find the more you put in, the more you get out. Find out more, houseplanninghelp.com/join. That's it for today. Thank you so much for listening. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.